Hi there, guys. So there was an interesting article in The Guardian yesterday which looked at how the probation service is failing to assess thousands of people who pose a risk to women. So I'm going to have a quick look through the article here just to explore the main themes. But I want to link this back to some of what Reform UK and Nigel Farage have been saying over the summer, where they've been talking about this, how we're a lawless country. But let's have a quick look at the article and then I'll get to that. So it says the probation service in England and Wales is failing to monitor and assess tens of thousands of offenders who pose a serious risk to women and girls. Martin Jones, the HM Chief Inspector of Probation, launched a 6-month inquiry into failings in public protection, and he said it was inevitable there would be more murders, rapes and serious sexual offences without an improvement. And his comments come amid concerns that there's a shortfall in staff in the probation service, and as the government increases its workload by having more criminals in the community tagged and monitored. And Jones said several inspections had found that about a third of offenders who were released into the community were not being properly assessed. So going on, he said what that means in really sharp terms is that staff do not understand enough about the risk of the people that they're managing. And where they do have information, they're not utilising that to mitigate and manage risk. And what that means, sadly, is that women and children are at risk of violence in some way, largely perpetrated by men on probation. And he goes on, the probation service is managing 160,000 offenders in the community, and they found that 2/3 of those cases, around 100,000 cases, are not being managed properly. So we're talking about tens of thousands of people who pose a risk to women and girls. So as I mentioned at the start, I want to link this back to Reform UK and Nigel Farage, because they've spent all summer talking about how crime-ridden the UK is and how we're essentially a lawless country, and especially how our women are at risk from criminal immigrants. Most of that is obviously total bollocks, but as this article suggests, we've got serious problems in this country with crime and also with the management of offenders. But I want to pick up on the fact that it's not for the reasons that Reform highlight. Ultimately, the challenges that are being talked about in this piece, they're a direct result of 14 years of austerity politics. We've got a criminal justice system in this country that is almost entirely focused on punishment and locking people up. We've had the disastrous reforms that were pushed through by Chris Grayling under the Tory government. And we had 14 years under the Tories of sort of chronic underfunding, which has left the probation service hollowed out, got a demoralised workforce, and with very few experienced probation officers left. And of course, in that context, they're struggling to attract new people into the profession as a result. Added to that, we've also had over the last 14 years the hacking back of almost every other supportive function of the state. So, for example, there's less mental health support, there's less support for struggling families, there's less support for people with substance abuse problems, and of course you've got all the problems around housing. Interestingly, over the summer, when he was on his crime bandwagon, Farage pledged to spend about £17 billion on policies which he said would halve crime in the next parliament. And, that included sort of proposals to send prisoners offshore, and it also included proposals to construct 5 new Nightingale prisons. So I'm not quite sure exactly how spending £17 billion fits in with Reform's Doge agenda to cut public spending, but I'm going to park that for just 1 minute. No, what was really missing from Farage's master plan to reduce crime was any acknowledgement or plan to tackle repeat offending, to fund the probation service, or to deal with all the societal issues which lead people to commit crime or to reoffend. So, stuff like mental health, stuff like substance abuse, housing issues, family breakdown, all of that hippie, woke, left-wing nonsense. Obviously, Farage didn't mention any of that, did he? Now, if we want to talk specifically about risks to women, why haven't we heard Reform talking about programmes for domestic violence offenders? Obviously, that doesn't fit their narrative, does it? But without that, women are still going to be at risk even after Reform have spent this 17 billion quid, because eventually, people do get out of prison, and unless you've done the heavy lifting to change their sort of toxic outlook and worldview, to challenge their faulty thought patterns and to challenge their aggressive behaviours, prison's going to be pointless because they're going to come out and they're just going to reoffend, they're going to continue to be abusive outside. Bringing it back to this story in The Guardian, what's obvious from this probation story is that harsher punishment isn't really the answer. It might be good for a sort of positive headline in the Daily Mail, but unless you've got a plan to deal with all those societal issues that I mentioned, all that woke crap, and fully fund and resource probation, and fully fund and resource all those other connected services that I talked about, it's all going to come to naught. And, we have to remember that at some point, presumably Reform, going to get into government, they're going to have to make good on all these promises. And it's quite obvious to me that they simply haven't got any answers. just locking people up doesn't work, because if it did work, we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place, would we? All the while, the Reform are doing this sort of performative cruelty to prisoners, but vulnerable people are still going to be left at risk because they haven't addressed any of the issues that I've talked about here. Please let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts on this sort of crisis in probation and in the criminal justice system? Are Reform's plans stacking up on this front? Let me know. But thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.